Today we're going to be talking about Final Fantasy VII. Mainly Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, but generally Final Fantasy VII in general. And since the closest Final Fantasy VII related product I have within reach is Crisis Core, that's what you get to look at in this video for the majority of this little debacle. I actually typed out what I wanted to say regarding everything that has happened in this remake franchise. It's going to be a long one. I've seen a few reviews about Final Fantasy VII's Rebirth's ending thus far, and many appear to be on different pages as to what could be going on. I thought I'd throw my 2 cents into the ringer because, well, I'm just that big of a fan of this series that I've seen the entire story. I've seen the whole story of Rebirth early. That's right, I know the plots of Rebirth, the remake, parts 1 and 2, and the DLC and all that other stuff in between. I know all of that stuff. And I knew right away that something wasn't right in Remake Part 1 when I saw those whispers for the very first time. My senses were tingling. Something different was afoot. Now, I had been more than vocal prior to Remake Part 1's release that Final Fantasy VII on the PS1 is a fantastic game that didn't need a remake. I thought it was fine as is. The only reason you'd need to remake Final Fantasy VII would probably be to incorporate plot elements from the compilation series that didn't exist at the time of Final Fantasy VII PS1's conception. That you needed to do something different. But then, why not just make a sequel to Dirge of Cerberus at that point, right? The fandom seems kind of split. There's a sizable portion that said to leave the PS1 game alone. I was of that number. There was a sizable portion that said to remake it, though. Yeah, that it's due for one. I was against this idea. I remember those days fondly, back in the mid-2010s, having long-winded Final Fantasy VII debates and thrusting my Final Fantasy VII compilation knowledge upon my friends. Because I felt like I was the only one on this side of the planet who knew about Before Crisis, which made me feel really cool. But then the remake came out. I had my reservations. But then, suddenly, I found myself loving both of these games. And then I finally decided to put my knuckles down to the grind. I gave it a look-see. I found a full cutscene playthrough online and watched it from start to finish, both of them. The changes were noticed immediately. After a while, I started to realize something about these whispers. They seemed to only show up when the plot was going too far off course from the original game. At least in Part 1 they did. Now, Sephiroth showed up earlier than usual, and the whispers showed up with him. Suddenly, something felt a little bit off about this Sephiroth. He seemed to know way too much about what was going on, almost as if he'd been here before. And then that got me thinking, what if this was a Sephiroth from the future? What if this was a Sephiroth post-Advent children, even? I said to myself, what if this Sephiroth came back in time, somehow figured out that the livestream could do that, maybe? Who knows? But he's here now, and he's intent on defying fate. He's defying his future. That seems to be his MO, and you start to wonder about that. Sephiroth wants to win. Why is he defying fate? Could it be because he knows that it is his fate to lose, that Cloud defeats him in Advent Children? He says that he will never be a memory before he fades away. Could Final Fantasy VII Remake, then, instead have been a sequel remake? A requel, if you will. What is a requel? Well, let's pull out my handy-dandy little pen here and our little handy-dandy little paper here. We're going to write down the word requel, just so you've heard me correctly. A requel. Now, a requel is different from a sequel. And both a requel and a sequel are different from a prequel. And all three of these are different from a reboot, which are also different from a remake. Alright? We have requels, sequels, prequels, reboots, and remakes. We're in the age of this right now. It's best get used to it. A requel is something like a sequel and a remake, or a reboot at the exact same time. It is revisiting something that has already happened, but doing it differently while also maintaining that the original thing that it's doing differently is also something that has actually happened. Timey-wimey, what the doctor says. Yeah, so could it be a requel? Aerith seemed to know what these whispers were as well. And after the final battle in Remake, once you hit Rebirth, the second game, one of the earlier things she mentions is that she seems to have lost something that day of her final battle in Remake, pulling out her holy materia, a gift of her mother's, and it was empty. There's no glowy, whitey glowy stuff inside of it. She didn't seem to be as in the know anymore, at least not for now. And then the biggest plot twist, at the end of Remake, we see a scene from the ending of Crisis Core. Zack's final stand outside of Midgar. We knew how that story ended, but then something happened. He didn't die. He survived. He found his catatonic buddy Cloud, picked him up, and dragged him on back into Midgar. And then we get Intergrade, we get Yuffie's story, and might I say Yuffie's story is excellent here. It gives you a much better introduction to her character that we didn't get to have in the PS1 game. It keeps her comedic, friendly demeanor, uppity demeanor about her, but also gives her a very serious and heartbreaking backstory as well. Deep Ground shows up earlier than expected, and Scarlet seems to be in the know of what this is, which makes sense. If you've played Dirge of Cerberus, of course Scarlet knows all about Deep Ground. I'm not sure Rufus does, though. It seems the Remake series is bringing in all of the elements of the complication. We see elements of Crisis Core, we see elements of First Soldier with Glenn Lodbrok showing up to bug Rufus in Rebirth. We see Dirge of Cerberus with the intermission stuff. We also might be getting Before Crisis stuff, maybe, too, maybe, perhaps? We'll get to a little bit of that in a bit. Now, I'm going to try to keep all this within the lines of whatever I happen to be in the know of, and I know some, but not all, of the interviews regarding Nomura, Kitase, Nojima, and all the other showrunners besides. The three big names, though, are those three. They are behind a lot of the fan theories, and more, based off what they have said in interviews. They're also the names behind the original Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy X, and their sequels and compilation titles besides. If there's some new interview you know about that I don't know about, please leave the door open to ignorance. As I said, these theories and consensus about what's going on with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth have been all over the place, probably because nobody seems to be on the same page as to what could be going on. So, regarding just the remake, intermissions, extra stuff, and Zack with whatnot, it's safe to assume that we have maybe 3 timelines at the end of Remake, that I'm guessing. Why 3? Because the timeline doesn't seem to add up for Zack when he returns to Midgar versus what he finds there. Zack died a few days to a few weeks before the events of Final Fantasy VII, and by the time he enters through the Midgar gates, we only see 2 stamp variations. Now, what is Stamp? Stamp is the mascot dog, and it's a little beagle in the original remake. But the dog changes depending upon the timeline you're in. That's how you can keep up with this stuff. Now, we only see 2 stamp variations to my knowledge, the beagle and the terrier. But this time discrepancy regarding Zack doesn't make sense to me. Unless Zack is in the same time stream, but he just happened to have jumped forward a few days because of what happened with the Whispers. That, or he jumped forward into a 3rd timeline that we don't know about. My current theory is that if Sephiroth is aware of what he can do now that fate has been broken, perhaps Aerith, a future Aerith, is also aware of what she can change from within the life stream, and she helped Zack survive so that he could help take out Sephiroth. Another potential theory I have is that Zack, while he woke up immediately and wasn't catatonic like Cloud, is still part of the Jenova project, and was one of the few who did not join in the reunion, and perhaps Zack was saved by Sephiroth, so that the Jenova cells within him could return to Sephiroth and do the reunion stuff at the Northern Cave in Part 3, maybe. Who knows? His role is still a wild card to me at present. It seems to be either Aerith or Sephiroth who have plans for him, and maybe they both do. Now we move on to Rebirth proper, where we have 3 other stamp variations, and here's why I think there are so many. Every decision Zack makes in the timeline he's found himself in creates a new branched timeline. He literally exists as a paradoxical entity that can't be here, because he's supposed to be dead. But he's not. A dead man making an impact on a world he should no longer be a part of is going to branch it every single time. Meeting Elmira and giving her memories of him, new timeline. Talking to Marlene, new timeline. Saving Aerith from the Shinra helicopter, new timeline. And not just those 3 that we see, there could be countless more for every second Zack remains around. In order for the timeline to correct itself, he, regrettably, has to die. But before that, perhaps he could stick around long enough to help his buddy Cloud take out this future-aware Sephiroth. So, what's going on in Zack's world? Well, here are my thoughts. Zack and the catatonic Cloud are from the Crisis Core timeline. Zack was literally dragging his buddy Cloud through wherever he went through to get to where he is now. And Aerith, the Aerith he rescues from the Shinra helicopter in the timeline that Zack finds himself in, is from that new timeline. Near the end of the game, when Cloud wakes up from the wheelchair after the Temple of the Ancients segment, he's in the wheelchair that the catatonic Cloud has been passed out in. However, this is not the same Cloud from Crisis Core that Zack dragged all the way to Nibelheim. From Nibelheim. This Cloud's consciousness is from our Rebirth timeline that we've been playing as this whole time. Aerith seems to now be aware of the crossed timelines. Pay attention to that holy materia. It's filled with power in Zack's timeline, but it was empty in the Rebirth timeline. Aerith somehow knew to come here, to give Cloud the corrected holy materia, and then bring him back to the Rebirth timeline so that he could give her the actual holy materia in place of the empty one. Are you still with me so far? Sephiroth was walking into the church when Aerith gives Cloud the materia, implying that he kills her as soon as she pushes him back into the trans-dimensional gateway realm. Now, however, like I said, there are many versions of this strange timeline Zack's found himself in. There's one where he goes to Shinra HQ to talk Hojo about Cloud, which we never really see the aftermath of. There's one where Zack chooses to go help Biggs, which ends in Biggs being shot and Zack escaping the army that showed up, which we also don't see the aftermath of. And then we have the third one where Zack is hanging out in front of the church when Sephiroth walks up to go into the church. And it's at this point where I'm thinking to myself, maybe we're about to get a sitcom drama little thing here, because here Zack is hanging out in front of the church right around the exact same time that Cloud and Aerith are heading towards the church, and you're thinking, oh my goodness, are they in the same timeline? Are they going to run into each other? That will be very awkward if that happens. So of course Sephiroth shows up and yeets him out of the timeline. Now, in my theory, there's one I'm thinking that Zack never went inside the church. Maybe if Cloud and Aerith are inside the church at the time Sephiroth walked up to go inside, you know, he just probably showed up later while Cloud and Aerith are inside the church, yada yada. There's a lot of stuff to think about with that regards. This video is going to be a long one, folks. So after the final battle, Zack wakes up in the church again, unsure if he dreamt what just happened or if he was certain if he wasn't even certain if it happened at all, before deciding to do it again. That is, bring the worlds together. Zack seems hell-bent on taking a firm grasp on his destiny and his life. The plot seems hell-bent on killing him, and he seems hell-bent on not dying this time, which means, in regards to his character arc, it seems he'll have to understand that he has to die in order for things to fix themselves, and he might be making an ultimate sacrifice later on in the future. Well, that's timey-wimey stuff. It's for part 3 to figure out. Let's talk about a few other things I wanted to go over. Like Sung, I paid attention to Sung's character this time around, and his expressions, his facial expressions that he spoke. Sung is a very complicated character, especially if you look at not just Crisis Core, but in Before Crisis as well. Now, what is Before Crisis? Before Crisis is a mobile game that released in Japan on the Nokia mobile phones. The Western phones weren't really strong enough to handle the game or whatever, so it was just Japanese only for the longest time. And it released in like chapters, kind of like Final Fantasy IV The After Years did. And it detailed the events of before Crisis Core, during Crisis Core, and just after Crisis Core, from the Turks' point of view. And if you look at that, you learn that Sung is friends with Zack. He's aware of what happened to Zack and Cloud. He had a small window where he could defy President Shinra and pick Zack up before the army found him. Zack tells Sung he's counting on him to look after Earth. Sung has had reservations about all of the things that have been going on this whole time, but his loyalty is to the Turks, as well as to his friends. The Turks know way too much in regards to Shinra Company secrets to ever be allowed to leave Shinra alive. To be a Turk is to be a Turk for life. That is why any undercover Turk you see is probably somebody who has been announced MIA or KIA. Sung's hands are tied in many regards, but he does what he can here and there. And you can see it on Sung's face when you first see him in the cave after the calm segment. He looks at Cloud and he entrusts Aerith's safety to him, thinking she'll be better looked after out here than she would be inside Midgar. He never tells her about Zack's fate, despite knowing what Zack's fate was. He never tells Cloud the truth either. On this, I don't know why he does or doesn't. Perhaps he was ordered not to tell them by Rufus or Hojo. Hojo, after all, has been orchestrating this entire franchise since the very beginning all the way to Dirge of Cerberus. The scene in the Temple of the Ancients was not his deathbed, like the PS1 game might have led us to believe. So I could see why Sung didn't spill everything to her right then and there, and tell her the truth about Zack, Cloud, and everything else. But this is the last time he ever gets to see Aerith at the same time. That was his last chance to come clean, because she's gone after this. Which brings me to Aerith, and the very complex web of emotions that is her character. There is a profound sadness that sleeps behind every smile, that cheerful get-going attitude that disguises a heart full of pain. Aerith very clearly has abandonment issues. Her real mom dying, her lack of friends growing up, the tests and the needles and the pokings and the proddings by Shinra scientists, the fact that she fell in love with what is essentially a shonen protagonist who never came back after promising her that he would. She wrote him dozens of letters and she received nothing. No word. I'm sure she's pestered Sung about this relentlessly, and he wouldn't or couldn't tell her anything. For 5 years, Aerith has lived without closure as to what could have happened to the man she loved, thinking about what that... Think about what that does to somebody. Think about what it means to care about someone to the point you don't truly move on, even after years have passed. I almost get the feeling that she's forcing herself on Cloud, trying to relive a lie, because he reminds her so much of Zack. They met the exact same way. She tried to recreate a date she had with Zack. She's trying to make of this reminiscent of a person Cloud is not, and that's not fair to either of them. Cloud has been imprinting Zack's characteristics upon himself, and is a tragic result of Mako poisoning, catatonia, amnesia, and misattributions due to deep-rooted inferiority complexes that Cloud has been dealing with for years, long before his exposure to Mako. Aerith may have generally fallen for this man as time went on, but you cannot escape the feeling that she's trying really hard to recapture Zack in Cloud, rather than to see Cloud in Cloud. This time around, we have HD, so Pay attention to her facial expressions. Pay attention to their eyes. Pay attention to the tone in her voice. Pay attention to the disappointment when things don't happen the way they did with Zack. I don't blame her for this, not at all. She's never gotten her closure with him, and now things are getting a little bit complicated, and Zack is still not here. She dies without ever learning the truth about what happened to him, and that is tragic. That is heartbreaking. Through no fault of Zack's own. You can shake this story any way you want, but it still ends at Zack dying right outside the gates of Midgar. His catatonic, misattributed, amnesiac best friend gets attracted to his girlfriend that he came all this way to see, and now she starts falling for him too. What twisted joke of fate could ever be played upon a man? You feel so bad for Zack, no matter which side of the Tifa-Aerith war you're on. But you feel even worse for him if the Aerith war wins out. Because Zack loses through no fault of his own. He's knocked out. He's dragged by Hojo into a lab for experimentation for 4 to 5 years. His friend Sung is too afraid of his own job security to help him to stop this. He wakes up. He drags his catatonic buddy Cloud halfway across the world. Yes, the world. The friggin' world. Open up a map of the Final Fantasy world, Final Fantasy VII world, and look at Nibelheim and see how far it is from Midgar. That's how far Zack traveled. Why did he go to Midgar? Could he have gone anywhere else? He could have taken Cloud anywhere. You'd think he has no reason to go to Midgar. Shinra's after him, and that's where Shinra is. The logical plan would be to go in the opposite direction of Shinra, of Midgar. Maybe even to Wutai. Surely he'd find sanctuary there. They don't like Shinra any more than he does at this point. He went to Midgar because Aerith was in Midgar. Don't shake this any other way. There's no other reason to go back to Midgar, except to go back to her. So when you keep that in mind, and you try to romance Aerith as Cloud, who is still amnesiac, who has been told all about Aerith by his best friend Zack, and clearly you realize that Zack is over the moon for her, but he just can't remember any of it. He falls for her probably out of his Zack imprinting, and less so out of a genuine falling for her, because there's a small part of his psyche that thinks this is the right place to be, because Zack kept talking about her to his catatonic state of mind, and all that other crap besides. When you take all of this into account, how guilty do you think Cloud will feel after he gets all of his memories of Zack back? How horrible do you think he's going to feel? Knowing that he did that without even remembering if his friend was even alive or dead, without her ever knowing that factoid. How undeserving of Tifa do you think Cloud will feel when all of this comes rushing back to him? That he distances himself from her during the Advent Children story because of all of the guilt weighing him down like a half-ton of bricks. Guilt in not being able to save Aerith. Guilt in falling for a girl he couldn't even remember was the girl of his best friend. Guilty in learning that his fate was something that she never was told about. Man, that's hard, man. That's cold, man. That's deep. I'm sorry, I couldn't do that to either of them. I romance Tifa. Because I think that's the more canon choice at the end of the day, and what with the body language of Rebirth finally showing us in high definition these characters and the tension in the room surrounding them, I really do believe that there is far more real believability in romancing Tifa than in romancing Aerith. Let me explain. Cloud and Tifa knew each other since childhood. They were practically neighbors. Rebirth builds up on this a fair bit in regards to Cloud having always had a crush on her. or being too shy to do anything about it. He'd even be a creepo and watch her from the water tower in the middle of town. This water tower had like a beeline view into the second floor window where Tifa's bedroom was. Aerith even teases him, asking him if he came up here as a kid specifically to do that. You get the option to say, yeah, that's exactly what he did. You could see earlier than normal. You see in the game earlier than you normally would, because you normally see this next bit that I'm about to say. You see this portion in my deal during the live stream segment, but you get to see it early when Tifa falls into the Gunga Gaga reactor live stream thing. She gets to see through the live stream her past. And you could see earlier than normal that Tifa went into Mount Nebel looking for her mom when she was a child. Her friends joining her, with Cloud being in the back, too shy to take part in the reindeer games. But one by one, her friends abandon her because the road is a little bit too perilous and they're a little bit too scared. But Cloud doesn't abandon her. And when he sees that she's in trouble, he tries to save her. But he just isn't strong enough, and it ends in both of them getting hurt. Cloud's blamed by Tifa's father, and the story gets out that her injuries were his fault. Tifa learns the truth of this in the live stream, reminiscent of the scene in my deal, only that it happens earlier this time. When Cloud leaves Nibelheim to join Soldier, Tifa starts to think about him often. She might have even built this ideal of him into her head over those 5 years. And keep in mind that she never actually saw Cloud in Nibelheim when Zack and Sephiroth showed up with those few infantrymen. Cloud was one of the infantrymen, but he was so embarrassed that he kept the helmet on the whole time so that she never saw him. But oh my gosh, this remake sequence of the Nibelheim flashback it's genius for recreating a lot of Zack's scenes, but with Cloud pasted over it, verbatim from Crisis Core. But the real Cloud is still there too. There's a specific moment when Cloud is heading for his mom's house while Nibelheim is on fire, and you see a Shinra infantryman on the floor right in front of the house. He's looking up at the house, reaching out with his hand, and he tries to say Mom, but he can't get the word out, and before falling to the floor, helpless. You're looking at the real Cloud at that moment, through the eyes of Zack, whom Cloud has imprinted upon, and that is genius. Bravo. Well done. But yeah, he is very embarrassed to show Tifa that he didn't make the cut, that he didn't become the big shot hero, and he hates himself for it. He wanted to be strong. He wanted to be the hero he saw in people like Sephiroth. Because someone like Sephiroth wouldn't have let Tifa fall off that bridge all those years ago. He would have been stronger. He would have saved her. He would have prevented her from getting hurt. Somebody like Zack, if he was as strong as Zack, he could have stopped Sephiroth from hurting Tifa that day. His mind is full of all of these woulda, coulda, shoulda. So many insecurities, and they surround the Tifa character. They don't impact him like that with Aerith. Aerith almost feels too easy, too dreamlike, like he's embracing a lie and running away from his problems. He won't face his insecurities and overcome them by embracing this lie that he's a soldier, that he's a big shot hero man, yada yada yada. He'll face them if he turns to Tifa, and that makes him scared. In the Gungaga scene, Cloud tells Tifa that he sometimes doesn't feel like he's himself. He confides in her a lot of things that he doesn't tell Aerith. There's tension here. There's this give and there's this take, and it's real. It's because it's real. Tifa is trying to interact with the real Cloud. She's trying to bring the real Cloud back. She doesn't give two craps about a soldier. She never liked soldiers since Nibelheim. She wouldn't have cared one way or the other if Cloud made it into a soldier or not. She cares about the real Cloud, which is someone Aerith never even met. And the thing is that Cloud has demons. Cloud has the insecurities. He has to eventually face them. If he's going to recapture his true self, he's going to have to accept his weaknesses and his faults and learn to overcome them, instead of running away and embracing this beautiful lie. He misattributed. Now I've been saying this word a lot. What is misattributing? I've also mentioned catatonia and all this other psychological terminology, mumbo jumbo as well. Well, what is catatonia? Catatonia is different from being comatose. If you're comatose, you're like in a state of unconsciousness. And you're catatonic, you technically are conscious, but your mind and your body aren't necessarily in sync with each other. You might even be aware of your surroundings. You might even be able to hear things when people speak. You might even be able to remember things that your eyes see that your body's not really reacting to. You might, when you come out of this catatonic state, have memories of things that you have experienced in this state of catatonia, which doesn't happen with comatose. Misattribution would be imprinting Zack's personality traits, Zack's history, Zack's fighting styles, all of the stories that Zack has told Cloud. If you're imprinting that, you are taking all of that that's not yours and saying that that was you, if that makes sense. He misattributed Zack onto himself as a way to protect himself from having to deal with the fact that Zack died, because he was catatonic with Mako poisoning and couldn't look after himself. Zack lived and died like a true hero, and Cloud doesn't even think he deserves to be called one, which is why he's shutting those thoughts away. It's too difficult to face them. But that's part of life. We have to face these sides of ourselves. We can't just run away forever. As much as we want to, as easy as it may seem to be to do so, life is hard. We aren't perfect. We're not overpowered fantasy power muscle folk. Sometimes we're going to fail, and we have to deal with that. We have to face that. And sometimes we have to realize that we don't have to be perfect for people to like us. People who truly care about you will care about you no matter what state you're in. Because it is not the lie that you tell yourself that people like about you. It's you. The real you. That's who they want. That's who they like. You may not like yourself, but they do. That's deep. And it really hurts to think about sometimes, but there it is. It also helps that Cloud kisses Tifa in their date scene, and he doesn't kiss Aerith. This would be his last chance to do so, because she's kinda... There's a scene in My Deal, in the original continuity, where Cloud falls into the life stream. He wakes up in My Deal, where Tifa finds him, and she says that she's going to stay behind and care for him, even if the world is ending. She'll entrust dealing with that stuff to Sid and the rest, while she takes care of Cloud. It's a wonderfully heartbreaking moment when you see Tifa break down and realize just how much she needs this person sitting helplessly before her. She needs to find him. She needs to bring him back. She also doesn't care if he ever comes back, because she'll care for him either way. She'll look after him until the meteor falls and it's all over. But that doesn't happen. Instead, he falls into the life stream again. And without a second thought, she dives in right after him. She helps him piece his mind back together down there, while also getting to re-experience things she didn't remember as purely as before. It's one of the closest things two people could ever experience together. She sees Cloud for the truth, and finally accepts that truth, and he finally accepts that truth of himself as well. They come out of this experience changed people, but they also come out of that moment together. At least for the moment. they don't have to deal with the ramifications of the past for at least that moment. What Cloud has done, the guilt behind Zack and Aerith, he doesn't have to deal with it for right now, until after they save the world. So, at least for the moment, for this one beautiful moment, Cloud can share that moment with Tifa under that airship. Tell me that this series wasn't building this relationship up. Tell me that that's not the real one there. Tell me that, Tell me that, In Advent Children, now that the world is saved, Cloud has to deal with his own mind space and the issues he still has within himself, and his actions while he was an amnesiac and misattributing Zack onto himself. He forgot Zack because he couldn't deal with the pain of loss associated with his death, and the result of that was getting close to the girl of Zack's dreams, Aerith. With her lack of closure, also falls for Cloud because nobody told her the truth about Zack. Cloud could have told her the truth about Zack, if only he remembered. He could have given her the closure she needed, and the shoulder to cry on that she needed. Would they have fallen for each other had Cloud kept all of his memories? Well, I want to say maybe not. But that still could have happened either way, you could argue. And I'm willing to leave that card on the table that it could or could not have happened if he had all of his memories from the start. But as it happens in the main story, it's a beautiful lie. He carries that guilt and it weighs him down too much that he runs away again. And it's not until the end of Advent Children that he finally gets the courage to move on. Cloud and Tifa do not sleep in the same bed. There's 2 separate beds in their room. Cloud even has a separate bedroom at one point. But that is not to say that that they're not together. They may have grown apart, though. Remember, this is a Japanese series made by Japanese people attuned to Japanese culture. It is not uncommon for married couples to sleep in separate beds, if not even separate bedrooms, depending upon your status, your size of your house, and all that stuff. Tifa may love Cloud, but Cloud, he's still dealing with a lot of guilt. Guilt over losing Aerith, over losing Zack, his weakness in both senses and not being able to prevent them. If only he were stronger. If only his mind didn't succumb to Mako poisoning. If only he wasn't catatonic. If only he had better control over his body to fight against Sephiroth. If only he remembered Zack enough to tell Aerith the truth. If only. If only. It's a lot to unpack. And I'm not surprised in the slightest that happened to him. But hey, we have part 3 to think about. I can't wait to see how my deal turns out in part 3. And I have a few other things to discuss about, Rebirth-wise, regarding some Crisis Core nods. Like meeting Sisne and Gungaga. If anyone played Crisis Core, you know who she is. But did you know that she's also a playable character in Before Crisis? Her codename was Chakra, for that was the weapon of her choice that you got to use in the game. It's set before Crisis Core, but also continues after Crisis Core. At the end of Before Crisis, Sung believes himself, Reno, and Rude to be the only Turks left, and that Sisne and all of the others perished during this big fight with this creature called Zirconade. And he believed that they all died stopping Fuhido and stopping this big world-ending threat. Like I told you, a Turk can't just leave Shinra. They know too much. But if Sung isn't aware of Sisne and the rest of his charge's survival, then Verdot, his former boss, certainly does. In the book On the Way to a Smile, you learn that Reeve 2SD, who is the guy in charge of Cait Sith, he had been in contact with Verdot this whole time, and he probably also knew Sisne and the other Turks were alive as well. And he probably helped keep all of this under wraps. So, as a result, Sisne couldn't tell Cloud and company the truth about Zack any more than she could tell his parents. Nobody can know she's a Turk. But why? I'm guessing the plot changed just a tad in the Rebirth timeline, but I still don't think Sung is aware of her at present. But she may be getting orders from Reeve. and not Rufus. Which does make sense to me. She recognizes Cait Sith after all, and we know Cait Sith connects to Reeve, and Reeve is in contact with Verdot. Who's Verdot? Verdot was the former leader of the Turks during the Before Crisis and Crisis Core portions of the story. Sung doesn't officially take over until he's told by President Shinra to kill his former boss, though he does help fake Verdot's death, and Verdot goes underground with his daughter Elfei. Who's Elfei? Elfei is the figurehead leader of Avalanche, the first Avalanche. There was another Avalanche before Barrett started to call himself Avalanche. This original incarnation of Avalanche was a little bit bigger. It was a fair bit more militant. It was going on around the same time as the Genesis War, so Shinra was kind of spread a little bit too thin. Shinra sent the soldiers after Genesis, and they sent the Turks after Avalanche. There's a good English translated playlist right here on YouTube under the username Grimoire Valentine's channel. It's English, okay? There's a lot of good story in Before Crisis, so definitely give that a look. There's even a Before Crisis Easter egg here in Crisis Core. During one of the modulating phase scenes that you could see with a moment of one of Zack's friends, you have one with Sung, where the two of them are standing over two graves. These are the graves of two of Zack's soldier buddies that Fuhido and the former incarnation of Avalanche had kidnapped and turned into his own version of super soldiers, the Ravens. They were brainwashed into working for Fuhido, but the Turks and Zack managed to break the brainwashing on these two, but they couldn't save their lives. It's good stuff. I don't know what else I could go over here other than to say I really like what they do with Cait Sith and Yuffie this time around, although I can't help but think that ending was a little bit rushed. We need a little bit more scenes with Cait Sith in between Gold Saucer and the Temple of the Ancients to show us Reeve's resolve to help Cloud and his friends. It's probably the only issue I have with Cait Sith. They also skipped Bone Village and Rocket Town. Well, I didn't really love Bone Village. Rocket Town's a good place, though I'm guessing they'll probably save both of those for Part 3. It's a nice place to expand upon at any rate, like they expanded upon Gongaga and Rebirth, so maybe they're saving it to do something like that in the third part. They don't have a whole lot to do left. There's Wutai, Rocket Town, Icicle Inn, potentially Bone Village, the first visit to the Northern Cave, the escape from Junon, My Deal, the hunt for the huge materia, My Deal Revisited, the raid on Midgar, and then finally the Northern Cave Revisited and the finale. They'll have to do some other stuff here and there for certain, expanding Zack's role in all this, maybe expanding Wutai, adding Bone Village, perhaps, maybe even adding Benora and Medeoheim, maybe even expanding upon Deep Ground, expanding Vincent's stuff with the Wonderful Cave. A whole bunch of possibilities, but I do think there's enough for a third game here, and I can't wait to see how it turns out. That's the end of what I had typed out, but there are some other stuff that I have here bullet pointed, in case I didn't go over them already. The first bullet point is Aerith being alive in another timeline because Cloud saved her. Near the end of the game, in the Forgotten City, which was also very rushed, I hated how rushed the Forgotten City was. It kind of, they could have done it a little bit better. But in the Forgotten City, Cloud catches up to Aerith, and there is this weird timey-wimey thing where you see two versions of the plot happening at the same time. One version where Sephiroth stabs Aerith and kills her, and one version where Cloud is able to stop Sephiroth and save her. And both seem to have happened at the same time in two different timelines. So I'm not exactly sure what's going on there, but the Aerith that shows up for the finale battle is probably the Aerith that Cloud saved. Another bullet point here is the Gi. I've never talked about the Gi yet. The Gi, that is G-I. The Gi are a race of tribalistic spirits that show up in the original PS1 game as antagonists to Red 13 and his family and the people of Cosmo Canyon. And this time around, the Gi's story have been expanded. The Gi are a race of extraterrestrials that have come to Gaia, to Final Fantasy VII's Earth, to colonize it, but they were unwelcome here. The Cetra did not like them being here, and since their souls came from outside the planets, they could not rest in the planet's life stream. And so, as a result, their spirits were unable to find rest. So they had to trap their souls into these little effigies, into these little stone statues, if you will. Which brings me to the next bullet point. The Final Fantasy X connections to Final Fantasy VII, such as the life stream and the far plane. They're both the exact same thing. Spheres and materia. They're both very similar. Shinra, the character from X2, has been said in an interview between Nojima and Katase to be an ancestor of the Shinra family that we see in the Final Fantasy VII series. Their interview about they had many interviews about the connections between Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy VII. It's a very, very slight connection that began out of something of a joke. Because after writing the Final Fantasy X story, they realized after the fact how similar to Final Fantasy VII everything was, that they thought, you know what would be a good joke? If we went with it, if we rolled with it, and in X2 we actually made a character called Shinra. Let's just go full in with our nods and Easter eggs. And then it actually turned out to connect the two games and make them canon to one another, and that was excellent. This next bullet point is not canon, not confirmed at any rate. It's a very popular theory, though. Is Jenova actually Yunalesca? Now, this is a very far-fetched trilogy to be sure, but the theory is that Yunalesca is an unsent. And she was never really sent by Yuna at the end of the battle. She was just defeated. And, you know, when you defeated unsent, they could just come back. And so Yunalesca is probably still out there. And after a while, Yunalesca is probably going to go insane, much like Yu Yevon did. Yu Yevon being Sin. She'll probably have just one purpose, one last thing of consciousness before she went crazy, and that last thing of consciousness was to consume worlds, and destroy and wipe everything out. And that kind of sounds like what Jenova is, you know. So after the end of Spira, when the planet gets dried out of all of its Mako, and the humans decide to leave Spira for another place, Yunalesca could probably have left on a meteor or something to follow them. And that's the theory at any rate. And you know, the whole timeline, the space between this would be like thousands of years, so it wouldn't even matter if there are any connections regardless. Whatever connections there are, it's been far too long and there's nothing left that anybody remembers. At any rate. Then there's a theory that is Sephiroth and Unsent are the Gi unsent. And then you do have a strong notion for the Gi. An unsent is somebody who has not passed on into the far plane according to the Final Fantasy X rules. And since the Gi are not allowed into the life stream, their souls are bound to the living plane. They cannot cross over. And you could see that their souls can take physical form. And when they dissipate into these clumps of red lights that kind of look like red fireflies. And so you start to think, are the Gi unsent? Are they unsent people? Something to think about. And then my last bullet point before I can finally stop for the day is Shuyin's peculiar unsent powers versus Sephiroth's possessing ability. Is there a connection? This is a theory I looked up, and it's probably not connected at all. It's just a coincidence. But Shuyin, a character from Final Fantasy X2, has the ability to possess people with his malice, with his will, W-I-L-L, with a capital W, and cause them to do his bidding, much like Sephiroth can manipulate the Genova cells and people from the Genova project and make them do his bidding. It's a little connection, little coincidental, but that's it for today, folks. Until I come back when I feel like discussing something else and discussing more Final Fantasy Rebirth or Final Fantasy Remake or Final Fantasy Dirge of Cerberus and what is Hojo's plans and all of this, what is Sephiroth's plans and all of this. I only go over what I feel like going over. I didn't go over everything in Rebirth because I didn't feel like going over everything in Rebirth. I talk about what I feel like talking about, and when I feel like talking about something else, then I'll come back and talk about that. It's a good game, though. Rebirth is fantastic. Give it a look.